I don't know if I'm going to get blackballed for streaming in portrait, but this is more of an audio book than anything. And for the first time in a very, very long time, it's very surprisingly warm in my room. So you're not going to see much of me. I don't have a shirt on, and you don't need to see me. I have the chest of an 8-year-old boy. So here we are. We're on chapter 4, because in part 2 we managed to do chapter 2 and 3. So we can get straight on to chapter 4. No, nice to see you all as well. I hope you're all enjoying yourself. Let me just get settled in and we will start. Chapter 4 is called Tears of Blood. I hope you like the costume over there I've made. That's my Templar outfit for the comic convention in London. It's 5 days work really in total, I'd say. More like 3 full days, really. But I did a little bit here and there. Did most of it over a weekend. I really like it. Anyway, enough of that. Chapter 4, Tears of Blood. My parents prospered in the early years of their marriage. They moved into a small house by the railroad station that the military had given to my grandfather after he retired. It was very run down, but my father started fixing it up for his growing family. My mother became pregnant with my sister, Yeonmi, almost right away. Yay. She was born in January 1991. Well, I would have been 6. No. 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91. I would have been 7. Wait, we've read that already. My father left the metal foundry to find other jobs that gave him more freedom to be away from the office for days at a time to run his businesses. In addition to the cigarettes, shoving them in his clothes and walking around town, which we talked about last episode, he bought sugar, rice, and other goods in the informal markets in Hyesan, then travelled around the country selling them for a profit. Oh. I'll tell you what. Let's give you a candle as well in the back. There we are. Doesn't that look lovely? And then, after buying these in the markets in Hyesan, then travelled around the country selling for a profit. I read that bit. When he did business in Wonsan, a port on the East Sea, he brought back dried sand eels. Ew. Tiny, skinny fish that Koreans love to eat as a side dish. He could sell them for good profit in our landlocked province, and they became his best-selling product. Because my mother had spent her whole life in the centre of the country, far away from any outside influences, she didn't know anything about the black market. She didn't even understand the concept of business. This all changed during the 1990s. It's not that she didn't know business because they were kept in the house or anything. It was because the North Koreans, the more ideologically brainwashed you more, the more you relied on the state. You didn't need to understand business. That's capitalism. The state provided for you. Like when they had to explain to old Soviet women how to buy bread because they didn't know once the system changed. This all changed during the 1990s. What did we have? The Lion King, Jurassic Park, Guns N' Roses. This all changed in the 90s when famine and an economic collapse turned the whole country into a nation of traders in order to survive. But before that, capitalism was something dirty to North Koreans, and money was too disgusting for most people to mention in polite conversation. Now she was married to a businessman who made his living handling money. It took some getting used to. But like many loyal North Koreans, she was able to separate her ideology from her actions and did not see that there was much of a conflict. Oh, how easy that seems to be for the communists. She became a skilled trader herself. It may have felt unnatural to her at first, but she came to recognise that my father was more aware and competent than other people, and she followed his lead. Soon after they were married, she began helping him buy and sell his products in both the legal and underground markets in Hyesan. Even though my parents were better off than most of their neighbours, they were never members of the so-called elite. That kind of wealth came only from high-level government connections. However, they did not well. They did well enough to take a vacation trip to North Korea's monument-filled capital, Pyongyang. When Yeonmi was an infant, and my mother was able to dress in some of the fashionable clothes that were smuggled from China, she loved designer handbags, even if they were Chinese knockoffs. Japanese blouses and nice cosmetics. Years later, after our escape, I would joke that she was like the Paris Hilton of North Korea, but she was never extravagant, she just had a great sense of style. Despite her good fortune, my mother never stopped working, and nothing was too difficult for her. She was chopping firewood for the house late into her pregnancy with Yeonmi. The doctor said that's why she went into labour early and had her first baby in the 8th month. We think I was even more premature because in her 7th month, my mother was hauling coal across a railroad bridge in Hyesan. Bloody hell. The coal transport was part of a backdoor enterprise run by my grandfather Park. After he lost his job at the commissary, my grandfather found work as a security guard at a military facility in Hyesan. The building had a stockpile of coal in one storage area, and he would let my parents in to steal it. They had to sneak in at night and carry the coal on their backs through a darkened city. It was hard work, and they had to move fast, because if they were caught by the wrong policeman, which means one they could not bribe, they might end up getting arrested. One night on that bridge, my mother felt sharp pains in her abdomen. The next day, she delivered a baby the size of a young chicken. Me. According to North Korea, my grandfather Park and my parents were criminals. My father bought and sold goods for a profit. In other countries, he'd simply be called a businessman. He bribed officials whose salaries weren't enough to feed their families, in order to travel freely in his own country. And while it's true that my grandfather and my parents stole from the government stole everything from its people, including their freedom. As it turns out, my family's business was simply ahead of its time. By the time I was born in 1993, corruption, bribery, theft, and even market capitalism were becoming a way of life in North Korea, as the centralized economy fell apart. The only thing left unchanged when the crisis was over was the regime's brutal, totalitarian grip on political power. Throughout my childhood, my parents knew with each passing month it was getting harder and harder to survive in North Korea, but they didn't know why. Foreign media were completely banned in the country, and the newspapers reported only good news about the regime, or blamed all of our hardships on evil plots by our enemies. The truth was that outside our sealed borders, the communist superpowers that created North Korea were cutting off its lifeline. The big decline started in 1990 when the Soviet Union was breaking apart and Moscow dropped its friendly rates for exports to North Korea. Without subsidized fuel and other commodities, the economy creaked to a halt. There was no way for the government to keep the domestic fertilizer factories running, and no fuel for trucks to deliver imported fertilizer to farms. Crop yields dropped sharply. At the same time, Russia almost completely cut off food aid. China helped out for a few years, but it was also going through the big changes and increasing its economic ties with capitalist countries, like South Korea and the United States. And so it too cut off some of its subsidies, and started demanding hard currency for exports. North Korea had already defaulted on its bank loans, so it could not borrow a penny. By the time Kim Il-sung died in 1994, Famine was already taking hold in the northern provinces. Government rations had been cut sharply, but sometimes they failed to arrive at all. Instead of changing its policies and reforming its programs, North Korea responded by ignoring the crisis. Instead of opening the country to full international assistance and investment, the regime told the people to eat only 2 meals a day and to preserve our food resources. In his New Year's message of 1995, the new dear leader, Kim Jong il, called on the Korean people to work harder. Although 1994 had brought us tears of blood, he wrote, we shall greet 1995 energetically, single mindedly, and with one purpose to make the motherland more prosperous. Unfortunately, our problems cannot be fixed with tears and sweat, and the economy went into total collapse after torrential rains caused terrible flooding that wiped out most of the rice harvest. Kim Jong il described our nation's struggle against famine as the arduous march, resurrecting the phrase used to describe the hardships of his father's generation that they had faced fighting the Japanese imperialists. Meanwhile, as many as 1 million North Koreans died from starvation or disease during the worst years of the famine. The economic collapse disrupted every level of North Korean society. While it had once provided for all of our needs. Oh crap, where am I? Now the regime said it was up to us to save ourselves. When foreign food aid finally started pouring into the country to help famine victims, the government diverted most of it to the military, whose needs always came first. What food did get through to the local authorities for distribution quickly ended up being sold on the black market. Suddenly, almost everybody in North Korea had to learn trade or risk starving to death, and the regime realized it had no choice but to tolerate these unofficial markets. In fact, Kim Jong il eventually allowed permanent state-managed marketplaces to be rebuilt. The new reality spelled disaster for my father. Now that everyone was buying and selling in the markets called, the Yeonmi, there was too much competition for him to make a living. Meanwhile, penalties for black market activities grew harsher. As hard as my parents tried to adapt, they were having trouble selling their goods and were falling deeper into debt. My father tried different kinds of businesses. My mother and her friends had an ancient pedal sewing machine. They used to patch together pieces of old clothes to make children's clothing. My mother dressed my sister and me in these outfits. Her friends sold the rest in the market. Some people had relatives in China, and they could apply for permits to visit them. My uncle Park Jin did this at least once. But my father didn't because the authorities frowned on it and would have paid closer attention to his business. Those who went almost always came back across the border with things to sell in makeshift stalls on the edges of the Yeonmi. They told us about the amazing items you could find in the trash in China, even perfectly good clothes. Nothing went to waste in North Korea. We couldn't imagine throwing anything out that could be used again. Even empty plastic bottles, bags, and tin cans, these were like gold to us. When you are a very small child, all you know is what is in front of your eyes. Your whole life is your parents, your relatives, your neighborhood. It seemed normal to me that there were times when we had food to eat, and other times when there was only 1 meal a day and we went hungry. While they worked hard to keep us from catastrophe, my parents often had to leave my sister and me alone. If she couldn't find someone to look after us, my mother would have to bolt a metal bar across the door to keep us safe in the house. Sometimes she was away for so long that the sun went down and the house would get dark. My sister, who was afraid of the dark, would cry. I'd say, "Sister, don't cry. Uma will be here soon." But after a while, I would lose my nerve and we'd cry together. When we heard her voice at the door, we would run to it, sobbing with relief. It was so hard for my mother to come home to find us like that. But if she had food, all would be forgotten. In the free world, children dream about what they want to be when they grow up. and how they can use their talents. Oh crap, where are we? When I was 4 and 5 years old, my only adult ambition was to buy as much bread as I liked and eat all of it. When you were always hungry, all you think about is food. I couldn't understand why my mother would come home with some money and have to save most of it for later. Instead of bread, sorry, which one of these cans is the... It'll be the one that's got coconut. There we go. Sorry about that. Instead of bread, we would only eat a little bit of porridge or potatoes. My sister and I agreed that if we ever became adults, we would use our money to eat bread until we were full. We would even argue about how much we could eat. She told me we could eat 1 bucket of bread. I said I could eat 10. She would say 10. I would say 100. I thought I could eat a mountain of bread and I would never be filled up. The worst times were the winters. There was no running water and the river was frozen. There was one pump in town where you could collect fresh water, but you had to line up for hours to fill your bucket. One day when I was about 5 years old, my mother had to go off to do some business, so she took me there at 6 in the morning when it was still dark to wait in line for her. I stood outside all day in the freezing cold. By the time she came back for me, it was dark again. I can remember how cold my hands were, and I can still see the bucket and the long line of people in front of me. She has apologized to me for doing that, but I don't blame her for anything. It was what she had to do. For my mother, it's still a painful story that lives deep, deep inside her. She carries guilt to this day that she was not better able to enjoy my childhood. She was too busy worrying about getting us enough food to eat. Despite North Korea's anti-capitalist ideas, there were lots of private vendors who got rich by loaning money for monthly interest. My parents borrowed from some of them to keep their businesses going. But after black market prices collapsed and a lot of their merchandise was confiscated or stolen, they couldn't pay it back. Every night the people who wanted to collect their debts came to the house while we were eating our meal. They yelled and made threats. Finally, my father decided he couldn't take it anymore. He knew of another way to make money, but it was very dangerous. He had a connection in Pyongyang who could get him some valuable meals, like gold. Oh, valuable metals, sorry. Thinking of food as well. Like gold, silver, copper, nickel, and cobalt. And he could sell them to the Chinese for profit. My mother was against it. When he was selling eels and cigarettes, the worst that could happen that he might have to spend all of his profit on a bribe, or do short time in a re-education camp. Re-education. Oh, that phrase. You can live with that, she told him, but smuggling stolen metals could get you killed. She was even more frightened when she learned how he intended to bring the contraband to Hyesan. Every passenger train in North Korea has a special cargo car attached to the end of it called Freight Train Number 9. These Number 9 trains were exclusively for the use of Kim Jong-il to bring him specialty foods, fruits, precious materials from different parts of North Korea, and to distribute gifts and necessity items to cadres and party officials around the country. Everything shipped in the special car was sealed in wooden crates that even the police couldn't open to inspect. Nobody could even enter the car without being searched. My father knew somebody who worked on the train, and that man agreed to help smuggle the metals from Pyongyang to Hyesan in one of these safe compartments. My mother held out for a very long time. And then she finally agreed to the plan. It was the only way to survive. I think we'll push on and maybe do another chapter. It's only been 20 minutes. Chapter 5. The Dear Leader. The Dear Leader. Between 1998... 1998, I think I'm still in school. Between 1998 and 2002. So, 9/11 happened in 2001. Interesting time in America in 2002. Didn't have the Iraq invasion till 2003. Between 98 and 2002. My father spent most of his time in Pyongyang running the smuggling business. Usually, he would be gone for 9 months of the year. Oof, that's a pregnancy. Coming back only for infrequent short visits when he rode the train to Hyesan, along with his latest shipment of metal. My mother quickly learned to run the business in Hyesan, picking up packages from the train and delivering them to the smugglers who sold them across the border in China. When my father suffered a setback in his business, we would be poor and hungry again. But most of the time, things were getting better for us. When he was in town, my father entertained at our house to keep the local officials happy, including the party bosses who paid to ignore his absences from his official workplace. My mother cooked, and every North Korean man still had to go to their government-assigned job, even though they weren't paid for it after 95. He still had to go to help keep the country afloat. My mother cooked. That's why a lot of women went to the markets, you see, because the men still had to work for these unpaid jobs. My mother cooked big meals of rice and kimchi, grilled meat called bulgogi, and other special dishes, while my father filled everyone's glasses to the brim with rice vodka and imported liquor. My father was a captivating storyteller with a great sense of humour. I fell asleep listening to the sound of his voice and roars of laughter from men at the table. I was just happy when there was food to eat, and we could afford new shoes and uniforms for school. I was the smallest kid in my first grade class, and definitely not the smartest. I know this because in North Korea they line you up by your height and seat you in your class by your test scores. I had trouble learning how to read and write, and I needed special help. I hated being at the bottom of the class, and sometimes just refused to go to school. I had a headstrong personality, perhaps because I had to work so hard for everything I achieved. I was determined to learn how to read, so I struggled to make sense of all the characters swimming across the page. When my father was home, he would sometimes hold me in his lap and read me children's books. I loved stories, but the only books available in North Korea were published by the government and had political themes. Instead of scary fairy tales, we had stories set in a filthy and disgusting place called South Korea, where homeless children went barefoot and begged in the streets. It never occurred to me until after I arrived in Seoul that those books were really describing life in North Korea. But we couldn't see past the propaganda. When I finally learned to read by myself, I couldn't get enough books to satisfy me. Again, most of them were about our leaders and how they worked so hard and sacrificed so much for the people. One of my favourites was a biography of Kim Il-sung. It described how he suffered as a young man while fighting the Japanese imperialists, surviving by eating frogs and sleeping in the snow. which we all know to be utter bullshit because he was being educated in a in a Russian university. In the classroom, every subject we learned, math, science, reading, music, was delivered with a dose of propaganda. Kim Il-sung's son, our dear leader, Kim Jong-il, showed incredible loyalty to his father. And this was an example for school children. In class, we read a textbook about Kim Il-sung was so busy leading our nation that he would have to read documents while riding in his car. But this was hard because the road was bumpy and the pages would shake. But when Kim Jong-il was very young, he managed to cover the road with loads of sand to make the ride smooth and comfortable for his father. God, this is bullshit. Our dear leader had mystical powers. Jesus fucking Christ. Our dear leader had mystical powers. His biography said he could control the weather with his thoughts, and that he wrote 1,500 books during his 3 years at Kim Il-sung University. Even when he was a child, he was an amazing tactician, and when he played military games, his team always won because he came up with brilliant new strategies every time. The story inspired my classmates in Hyesan to play military games, but nobody ever wanted to be on the American imperialist team because they would always have to lose the battle. In school, we sang a song about Kim Jong-il and how he worked so hard to give our labourers on-the-spot instruction as he travelled around the country, sleeping in his car and eating only small meals of rice balls. Please, please, dear leader, take a good rest for us, we sang through our tears. We are all crying for you. This worship of the Kims was reinforced in documentaries, movies, and shows broadcast by the single state-run television station. Whenever the leader's smiling pictures appeared on the screen, stirring sentimental music would build in the background. It made me so emotional every time. North Koreans are raised to venerate our fathers and elders. It's part of the culture we inherited from Confucianism. So in our collective minds, Kim Il-sung was our beloved grandfather and Kim Il-jung was our father. Kim Jong-il, sorry. God, these names. It's interesting there. Confucianism, it's not bad to have respect for your elders because of what they've brought forward for you. You're living upon the bones of their culture that they've maintained for you. And then you get to take up and uphold it yourself whilst introducing something new, you know. Like how we went from typewriters to PCs. But you have the collective thought to that from communism, and suddenly they're the, father of the country, and obviously not in a good way. Once I even dreamed about Kim Jong-il. Wow. He was smiling and hugging me and giving me candy. I woke up so happy, and for a long time the memory of that dream was the biggest joy in my life. Jang Jin-sung, a famous North Korea defector and former poet laureate who worked in North Korea's propaganda bureau, calls this phenomenon emotional dictatorship. In North Korea, it's not enough for the government to control where you go, what you learn, where you work, and what you say. They need to control you through your emotions. Making you a slave to the state by destroying your individuality and your ability to react to situations based on your own experience of the world. My God, how much does that ring true today in our society? Wow. I'm reminded of the video of Chelsea Clinton, don't get me wrong. I have no love for Hillary Clinton whatsoever. But I do not hold the daughter responsible for the actions of the mother. I've never seen Chelsea Clinton do anything that gives me reasons not to like her. But at the same time, I've never really researched her life also. So maybe that's ignorance on my part. But watching her get absolutely, fake BTFO'd by some people that were having a go at her. They basically blamed her for the most recent shooting in New Zealand. And they said to her face, I want you to deep down understand, I want you to feel that. I want you to really feel that. And then I'm sat here reading this. They need to control you through your emotions, making you a slave to the state by destroying your individuality and your ability to react to situations based on your own experience of the world. This dictatorship, both emotional and physical, is reinforced in every aspect of your life. In fact, the indoctrination starts as soon as you learn to talk and are taken on your mother's back to the Inninban. Meetings everybody in North Korea has to attend at least once a week. You learn that your friends are your comrades, and that is how you address one another. You are taught to think with one mind. You are taught to think with one mind. As soon as you are in school, you are drilled in the 10 principles of the regime, like the 10 commandments of the Bible. Number 1. We must give all our struggle to unify the entire society with the revolutionary ideology of the great leader, Comrade Kim Il-sung. Number 2. Respect the great leader, respected Comrade Kim Il-sung with the utmost loyalty. Suddenly, no, we go straight to number 10. We must pass down the great achievements of the great leader, Comrade Kim Il-sung's revolution from generation to generation, inheriting and completing it to the end. You learn the principle of juche, or national self-determination, and you're taught to hate the enemies of the state with a burning passion. It's that line right there. You don't even really need to finish it. You are taught to hate the enemies of the state with a burning passion. You are taught to hate. Our classroom and schoolbooks were plastered with images of grotesque American GIs with blue eyes and huge noses, executing civilians or being vanquished with spears and bayonets by brave young Korean children. Sometimes during recess from school, we lined up to take turns beating or stabbing dummies dressed up like American soldiers. I was so scared that the Yankee devils would attack us again and torture me to death in the most evil way. In 2nd grade, we were taught simple math, but not the way it was taught in other countries. Oh. In North Korea, even arithmetic is a propaganda tool. A typical problem would go like this. If you kill one American bastard and your comrade kills 2, how many dead American bastards do you have? We would never just say American. That would be too respectful. It had to be American bastard, Yankee devil, or big-nosed Yankee. If you didn't say it, you would be criticised for being too soft on our enemies. Likewise, any mention of the Kims had to be preceded by a title or tender description to show our infinite love and respect for our leaders. One time, when my mother was preparing food in the kitchen, I grabbed a newspaper. I tried to read it for a long time before I realised I had just finished the title of our leader, our great comrade Kim Jong-il, the General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, the Chairman of the DPRK, National Defense Commission, and the Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, said today. I don't think my father was brainwashed the way the rest of us were. My mother has told me he was more aware of what the regime was doing to its people. I heard him grumble about it only once, and I didn't understand what my father was saying at the time. We were listening to the television broadcast, the television news broadcast, with the usual footage of Kim Jong-il inspecting our troops somewhere. The newsreaders were going on and on about how much the dear leader was suffering in the cold to give his benevolent guidance to the loyal soldiers when my father snapped, "That son of a bitch, turn off the TV." Holy shit. They love the phrase son of a bitch in North Korea. "That son of a bitch, turn off the TV." My mother whispered furiously, "Be careful what you say around the children. This isn't just about what you think. You're putting us all in danger." I had no idea my father was talking about Kim Jong il. I could never imagine showing disrespect for the regime or our leaders. That would be unthinkable. My father wasn't the only one who was beginning to think differently. In fact, capitalism was already alive and well, just a few blocks away in the bustling Zhangmadang, the private market. Only a few years earlier, the market had consisted of a few grandmothers selling homegrown vegetables and snacks. Now, a corrugated metal roof covered rows and rows of market stalls where the vendors sold everything from handmade rice cakes to Chinese athletic shoes. If you knew where to look, you could also find things like digital watches and DVD players from vendors who operated in the grey area between legal and illegal trade in the new North Korea. The smugglers who brought the black market goods back and forth to China lived in low houses behind the market along the river's edge. I got to know this neighborhood well, and when my father was in town with a shipment from Pyongyang, he would sometimes hide the metal in my little book bag and then carry me piggyback from our house to one of the smugglers' shacks. From there, some men took the package to Chinese buyers on the other side of the river. Sometimes the smugglers would wade or walk across the Yalu River. Sometimes they met their Chinese counterparts halfway. They did it at night, signaling each other with flashlights. It's very American. Torches. There were so many of them doing business that each needed a special code. 1, 2, 3 flashes, so they didn't get each other mixed up. The soldiers who guarded the border were part of the operation by now. And they were always there to take their cut. Of course, even with the authorities looking the other way, there were still many things that you were forbidden to buy or sell, and breaking those rules could be fatal. In North Korea, public executions were used to teach us lessons in the loyalty of God. Public executions. To teach us lessons in loyalty to the regime and the consequences of disobedience. In Hyesan, when I was little, a young man was executed right behind the market for killing and eating a cow. It was a crime to eat beef without special permission. Cows were the property of the state and were too valuable to eat because they were used for ploughing fields and dragging carts. So anybody who butchered one would be stealing a government property. It's like killing a swan in England. The young man had committed some other petty crimes. Actually, that might be an old wives' tale. I think it's just animal cruelty. I don't think the Queen technically owns all the swans. I think that's a made-up thing. I think it's considered some sort of national animal, though. The young man had committed some other petty crimes, but the cow was his main offence. He suffered from tuberculosis and had nothing to eat, but that didn't make any difference to the police. They announced his execution to the whole city and brought him to the market and tied him at the chest, knees and ankles to a heavy piece of wood. Three men with rifles stood in front of him and began firing. The executioners tried to cut the ropes with bullets, and it took a long time. Finally they succeeded, and the dead man flopped to the ground. My mother watched in shock as they rolled the body away, stuffed it into a sack, and drove it off in the back of a truck. Her blood went cold and she was unable to move her legs for a while. She couldn't believe that in her own country a human's life had less value than an animal's. Even a dog would be treated with more respect. Um, as I learned in the previous North Korean book, the reason they tie the ropes in three places at the head, chest, oh god, well, yeah, chest, knees, and ankles, is so once they shoot the chest rope first, you fall forward and it makes you look like you're bowing, as though you're apologizing, in death for your crime. Before they finally take the ankle one out and you drop to the ground. There was an endless list of crimes in North Korea. The government was obsessed with preventing corrupt ideas from penetrating our borders, so all foreign media was totally forbidden, were totally forbidden. Although many families owned televisions, radios, and VCR players, they were allowed to listen or watch only state-generated news programs and propaganda films, which were incredibly boring. There was a huge demand for foreign movies and South Korean television shows. Even though you never knew when the police might raid your house searching for smuggled media. First they would shut off the electricity, if the power was on in the first place, so that the video cassette or DVD would be trapped in the machine when they came through the door. But people learned to get around this by owning two video players and quickly switching them out if they heard a police team coming. If you were caught smuggling or distributing illegal videos, the punishment could be severe. Some people have even been executed by firing squad just to set an example for the rest of us. Radios and televisions came sealed and permanently tuned to state-approved channels. If you tampered with them, you could be arrested and sent to a labor camp for re-education. But a lot of people did it anyway. In the border areas, those of us with receivers could sometimes pick up Chinese television broadcasts. I was mostly interested in the food commercials. There were advertisements for exotic things like milk and cookies. Can I imagine milk and cookies being exotic? I never drank milk in North Korea. I didn't even know it came from a cow until after I escaped. My friend and I would watch these incredible things and understood that the Chinese had more. But it never really occurred to us that our lives could be any different. I'm often asked why people would risk going to prison to watch Chinese commercials, or South Korean soap operas, or year-old wrestling matches. I think it's because people are so oppressed in North Korea, and daily life is so grim and colourless, that people are desperate for any kind of escape. When you watch a movie, your imagination can carry you away for 2 whole hours. You come back refreshed, your struggles temporarily forgotten. My uncle Park Jin had a VCR, and when I was young, I would go to his house to watch tapes of Hollywood movies. My aunt covered the windows and told us not to say anything about it. I loved Cinderella, Snow White, and James Bond movies. But when I was 7 or 8 years old, the film that changed my life was Titanic. That was 1996, I think, possibly 98. It amazed me that it was a story that took place 100 years ago. Those people living in 1912 had better technology than most North Koreans. But mostly, I couldn't believe how someone could make a movie out of such a shameful love story. In North Korea, the filmmakers would have been executed. No real human stories were allowed. Nothing but propaganda about the leader. But in Titanic, the characters talked about love and humanity. I was amazed that Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet were willing to die for love, not just for the regime as we were. The idea that people could choose their own destinies fascinated me. This pirated Hollywood movie gave me my first small taste of freedom. But while the outside media offered me a glimpse of a larger world very different from the one I occupied, I never imagined I could live like the characters in those movies. I couldn't look at the people on the screen and think that they were real, or allow myself to envy their lives. The propaganda we fed inoculated me from any lessons I might apply to my own life. It also made me numb to the suffering that was going on all around me as the famine was taking its terrible toll. North Koreans have two stories running in their heads at all times, like trains on parallel tracks. One is what you are taught to believe, the other is what you see with your own eyes. It wasn't until I escaped to South Korea and I read a translation of George Orwell's 1984 that I found a word for this peculiar condition: doublethink. It is how you can shout slogans denouncing capitalism in the morning and then browse through the market in the afternoon to buy smuggled South Korean cosmetics. It is how you can believe that North Korea is a socialist paradise, the best country in the world with the happiest people who have nothing to envy, while devouring movies and TV programs that show ordinary people in enemy nations enjoying a level of prosperity that you couldn't imagine in your dreams. It is how you can sit in Hyesan watching propaganda videos showing productive factories, supermarkets stocked with food, and well-dressed people in amusement parks, and believe you are living on the same planet as your government leaders. It is how you can recite the motto, "Children are king," in school, and then walk home past the orphanage where children with bloated bellies stare at you with hungry eyes. Maybe deep, deep inside me, I knew something was wrong. But we North Koreans can be experts at lying, even to ourselves. The frozen babies that starving mothers abandoned in the alleys did not fit into my worldview. So I couldn't process it when I saw it. It was normal to see bodies in the trash heaps. Bodies floating in the river. Normal to just walk by and do nothing when a stranger cried for help. There are images I can never forget. Late one afternoon, my sister and I found the body of a young man lying beside a pond. It was a place where people went to fetch water. He must have dragged himself there to drink. He was naked and his eyes were staring, and his mouth wide open in an expression of terrible suffering. I had seen many dead bodies before, but this was the most horrible and frightening of all, because his insides were coming out where something, maybe dogs, had ripped him open. I was so embarrassed for him, lying there, stripped of his clothes and his dignity. I could not bear to look at him, so I grabbed my sister's hand and we ran home. My mother tried to help people when she could. Homeless wanderers would sometimes knock up on our door to beg for food. I remember one young woman who brought her daughter to her house. "I'm so cold, so hungry," she said, "but if you give me food, I'll let my baby eat." So my mother understood that feeling. My mother understood that feeling because she had young children too. She invited them inside the house, gave them both a plate of food. I watched them closely because her daughter was nearly my age. They were very polite, and they ate delicately even though they were starving. I often wonder if they survived and if they are still in North Korea. There were so many desperate people on the streets crying for help that you had to shut off your heart or the pain would be too much. After a while, you can't even care anymore. And that is what hell is like. Almost everybody I knew lost family in the famine. The youngest and oldest died first. Then the men, who had fewer reserves than women. Starving people wither away until they can no longer fight off diseases, or the chemicals in their blood became so imbalanced that their hearts forget to beat. My own family suffered too. Our fortune rose and fell like a cork in the ocean. In 1999, my father tried to use the trucks instead of trains to smuggle metal out of Pyongyang. But there were too many expenses to pay drivers and buy gasoline. Too many checkpoints, too many bribes. He ended up losing all of his money. My mother took me to my sister to live with the relatives for a few months while my father went back to his train business and made up his losses. We arrived in Kowon to find that my mother's baby was also struggling to survive. Mother's family, struggling. Grandfather Beon had died a few years earlier, and my grandmother was living with her elder son, Minsik, in the family home. Her youngest son, Jongsik, who had been imprisoned years earlier for stealing from the state, was visiting them as well. In the labor camp, he had caught tuberculosis. Which was I'm probably not pronouncing that right. Which was very common in North Korea. TB, man, we've worked that out. Now, there was so little food to go around, he was sick all the time and wasting away. My grandmother had taken in lots of neighbourhood children, and in order to make sure everybody else was fed, she ate only a tiny bit of food each day. She worried that she was a burden, even though she consumed so little and her bones were as light as a bird's. I loved my little grandmother hung with a wooden leg. She never got upset with me, even when I cried and pestered her to carry me on her back like a horse. She always smiled at me and was a wonderful storyteller. I would sit with her for hours, and she told me about her childhood in the south. She described a beautiful island off the southern coast called Jeju, where female divers can hold their breath for a long time and swim like fish, where they gather food from the bottom of the sea. I was so curious when she described the wide blue ocean to me, and the playful dolphins that live there. I had never seen an ocean or heard of such a thing as a dolphin. Once I asked her, "Grandma, what is the biggest thing in the world?" And she told me it was the whale that breathes in air from a hole in its back and makes a fountain come out. I had never even seen the pictures of whales, but they sounded like something I would like. Most of her stories were from the time of Chosun, when there was no North or South Korea, only one country, one people. She told me we had the same culture and shared the same traditions as the South. She also told me a little bit about the time she visited Seoul. Even though saying the name was forbidden in North Korea, you just didn't mention such an evil place. I knew it existed only from propaganda, newspaper articles describing anti-imperialist demonstrations by its oppressed masses. But somehow my grandmother planted deep inside me a curiosity about this place she had loved. She told me, "Come to my grave someday and tell me that the North and South are reunited." It was a sad time to visit Kowon because of the famine. So many people were dying. My grandmother took a lot of medicines, some opium for the pains of old age and other pills to help her sleep and forget the suffering around her. One morning, before I went out to play, I saw her take lots of medicine. "Grandma, why are you taking so much medicine?" I asked. She was very calm and she smiled at me. "Grandma just wants to have a good sleep," she said. "She needs a good rest." Later that afternoon, I heard a terrible sound coming from the house. It was my uncle Jong-sik calling my grandmother's name. We ran inside and he was shaking her in her bed, wailing, wake up, answer me." But she was lying there peacefully, and no matter how loud my uncle shouted, she could no longer hear him. A few months later, my uncle would also be dead. Sometimes I can still hear his voice screaming for his mother, begging her to wake up. There are some things I wish I could forget, but I know I never will. And we're at chapter 6. I think we'll leave it there. Looks like in chapter 6, which will be called City of Dreams, we get to the year 2000 when she's 7. Alright. This was fun. Whoa, 55 minutes. Okay, we did an hour. I will leave it there. Take care, everyone. Where's the stop button? Jeez. There we go.